think some ducks thought I was talking about them. To get started, let's quickly talk about compression. Compression is basically just volume automation, an automated way to reduce the volume of a track given certain parameters or a certain input. Sidechain compression is just automating the volume of one track using the input from another track. This is often used on drums to help them stand out amongst background music. It's also sometimes used on things like radio when people are talking, you want to duck the music in the background. The ducks just heard me. We're going to jump into Ableton now and take a look at some examples. So now that we're in Ableton, here's a demo track that I created. First I'll play it with the sidechain compression off, and then I'll play with the sidechain compression on. You can see when the sidechain compression is off, you can barely hear the drums, they're not very clear, and the mix is overall kind of muddy when the drums are kicking in. And now I'll play it with the sidechain compression on. Overall, you can kind of hear there's a bit of a volume drop, and that's because we're ducking the background music, and so it's giving us more room for the music to breathe, and you probably want to bring up the volume as well, probably in some post-production, maybe like a mastering chain or something. There are a lot of ways to configure sidechain compression. People often use their kick track or kick and snare tracks as input for the sidechain compression. This can work well. There are a couple of key issues. You likely don't want the compression to kick in for all your flams and ghost notes. You also want to probably treat your snare and kick separately. Longer samples can make it hard to control when the compressor turns on and off, and samples with a lot of frequency content, like a really thick kick or a really thick snare, can cause stuttering or re-triggers in your compressor. So when you're listening to the background music, you can have the compressors like kind of re-triggering, and you can see the gain reduction is like jumping all over the place. Personally, I recommend you use a ghost hit setup. I'm showing the one that I'm using right now in this track. You can see here I'm using an Ableton operator to just generate a very simple sine wave with a very short attack, a very quick decay. I have a little bit of a macro setup just so you can control the decay of the synthesizer itself. I have a utility here which I'm using to boost the gain a little bit on the synthesizer. The reason for that is just so we can trigger the compressor harder or lighter depending on what we want. I've added that to the macro controls as well. I'm going to include this sidechain kit in the video description. Inside the kit, you'll see that we're using a synthesizer, we got the utility, and then I've also added this compressor here and I've disabled it. And basically the goal of this kit is you drag and drop it onto a ghost track, and it gives you the compressor already pre-configured for some sidechain settings that I like to use, and you can just copy that over to your sidechain group. In this case, you can see up here, I've got a group. It only has one track playing right now, but you could imagine you could put other things in here as well. I grabbed a sample off of Splice just to make this demo track. The reason I like a ghost hit setup like this is the transient is very tight and very sharp, and that lets us trigger the compressor but then use the compressor's controls to trigger how long the compressor is open by using the attack and release parameters on the compressor, as opposed to using strictly the samples that we're using for the drums. This is actually very important for sample-based music because quite often we're using drum samples that are very heavy in frequency content, especially in lo-fi hip-hop. You're gonna have very fat kicks and snares. There are two main ways you can use sidechain compression. You can use it as a mixing tool, where you come in and you take this ratio, you probably crank it down quite a bit, and you just use it to make your drums stand out a little bit more in the mix. The other option is to use it as an artistic tool for a specific sound, and that's if you listen to like a lot of EDM, they do this really heavy, they have very, very strong sidechain compression, which causes that pumping sound where the music kind of like ducks down and then like slowly ramps in and then ducks down and ramps in, almost like a rhythmic effect for your sidechain compression. This is also often done this way in lo-fi hip-hop. As you can see here, for this track, I actually had the ratio up very high using my ghost hits, but my ghost hits are only on every quarter note. But you can notice here, the beat has a lot of flams and a lot of ghost notes for the kick and the snare, and it's got this little pickup snare at the end here, but I'm not sidechaining any of those. And what that does is it means that my ghost notes don't stand out as much against the mix, but the repeated kicks and snares, they stand out much more and they give it that kind of consistent flow of the beat. Another quick thing I just wanted to point out is you can see here I have my sidechain compression set to a release value of about 146 milliseconds, 150 milliseconds. The reason I chose this value is I usually try to get the gain reduction to come back to 0 right before the hi-hats are kicking in on the 8th notes. I'll play back the track one more time so you can listen for the effect that has, and you can watch the gain reduction as the hits kick in. Obviously, you're going to have to change this value depending on your BPM. For this BPM, which is currently set to 77, I found this value of 146 to be pretty good for that push and pull feel between the kick and the hi-hat just before we lead into the next snare. I'm also using quite a heavy swing on the hi-hats, so if you were to use the same BPM but reduce the amount of swing on your hi-hats, you may want to reduce the release time to somewhere between 100 milliseconds and 150 milliseconds is pretty good for this genre. Start with those values and just kind of tweak it to whatever the effect you're looking for. Also of note is I do have a little bit of an attack value. I don't personally like when a track has a sidechain compressor attack that's really, really low, like sub millisecond. You can see here Ableton lets you set it to 0.01 milliseconds. I don't particularly like doing that. I feel that when the compressor kicks in too quickly, it's a really steep drop off on the music and it can add artifacts. Thanks for checking out my tutorial on sidechain compression. Hopefully it helps you with your mixes. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. I may not have covered everything here. Hopefully I kept the plugins up long enough on the screen so you can copy my settings. These are pretty good generic settings for the BPMs between like 70 and 85, where probably most of this music is sitting. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. I'm hoping to get more of these videos out every week. I know I didn't get one last week. I had some technical difficulties, and due to the current lockdown situation, it is pretty hard to get some new RAM for my computer. I managed to find some compatible RAM in an old computer, and so I actually got everything back up and running, albeit I'm getting a little bit of latency through Ableton, but hopefully that doesn't stop me from creating more of these videos for you guys.